I would never suggest in a million years, Ken, nor would you, that the Holocaust is permissible or that it's acceptable. I'm just not willing to make the claim that it's objectively wrong. Would you agree with everything I've said there?
No, I think the Holocaust was awful, and I very strongly condemn it. But I see this as being an expression of my attitudes, like my emotional commitments, let's say. And I think it's worth pointing out that there are plenty of people who are very firmly on the anti-realist side, who, who seem to care a lot about, the way the world is run, and who have very strong moral commitments.
Don't worry, the conversation is about to begin, but before we start, I just want to take this opportunity to recommend that you go and check out Kane B's YouTube channel, after you finish watching this video, of course. On a serious note, Kane is not only an incredible and successful YouTuber, but he's also a sophisticated and intelligent PhD philosopher to boot. So needless to say, it was an incredible honour and privilege to feature him on this episode of A Magician's Thoughts. And if you do want to check out his channel, the link, of course, as per usual, is featured in the description below. Just before we move on, I want to take this opportunity to thank Kane for appearing on the channel, and I want to recommend to you, dear listener, that you get to the end of this video. This conversation is not only profound, but I dare say that this conversation is important. The ramifications of this discussion impact all of us. And so with that said, I give you Kane B. Hello everybody, you are listening to Magic Skeptic, aka Magic Dara, and you're all most welcome to another episode of A Magician's Thoughts. I'm absolutely delighted today to be joined by a philosopher and fellow YouTuber, Kane B. I should refer to you just as Kane, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't mind. Whatever you prefer. Kane is...
It reminds me, actually, I don't know if you ever played Tekken back in the day, but there was a character called Dr. B. I'm tempted to call you Dr. B. But in any case, Kane, you're so incredibly welcome to the channel. It's an enormous privilege to have you here. I've been a fan of your channel for quite some time, and you've actually been formative, as this discussion will go on to reveal. You've actually been formative in some of my own philosophical ideas. And so it's just an enormous privilege to have you here. You're so welcome to the channel, Kane. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you for having me on.
Well, truth be told, I just chanced my arm. I am something of a chancer. And I just reached out to you on Twitter and I just said, hey, look, my channel is growing slowly but surely. I've just crossed a particular milestone that I'm really pleased with, and I would absolutely love to have you on. And Kane, to his credit, and this is awesome, this is what makes Twitter so cool and what makes you so cool, frankly. You just DM'd me right back and you were like, yeah, cool, let's do it. And I was like, oh my God. I was actually out and about with my fiance at the time. We were about to go in to watch a movie and I got your response and I was getting all giddy and jumping around the bloody cinema. Perhaps I'm revealing a bit too much, but yeah, no, seriously, Kane, it's great to have you here. And of course, we're here today to discuss Sam Harris's so-called moral realism. And I was saying to you before we went live, Kane, that my audience and my channel is, I guess it's not really a complex philosophy channel, really. I mean, a lot of my content is just geared towards existential questions. Does something exist? Doesn't it exist? The arguments for God's existence. For Halloween, as I said, I did videos on aliens and ghosts and some silly bits and pieces like that. And so your channel is much more complex. I was joking with you before we began and saying that when I watch some of your videos, I find myself Googling words to just try and understand some of your videos. So, yeah, I mean, it's great to have you here, but we're going to dive into moral realism. Would you, Kane, just for the benefit of my audience, just tell us, first of all, who you are, how you got into philosophy, and then we'll segue into explaining what exactly moral realism is and why we should, care about it or whether or not it's true.
Yeah, okay, so, well, as you say, I'm a philosopher. I'm now coming to the end of my PhD. I mean, I've actually written up everything, so I'm right at the end of it. And yeah, I did a philosophy degree, did a philosophy master's. So I've been doing this for quite some time, and I guess if anybody knows of me, they'd know of me through my YouTube channel. And yeah, I'm not really sure what else to say by way of introduction. I mean, that's who I am. As for how I got into philosophy, I just sort of stumbled into it, really. I mean, it didn't. There wasn't any kind of grand moment where it was like, oh wow, this is my destiny, my life's calling.
You didn't have a road to Damascus experience, Kane.
It never happened. No, I just didn't know what else to do when I was trying to think about I wanted to go to university, wasn't sure what I wanted to study, and philosophy just seemed like it might be a good choice. It was. I think actually part of it was that it seemed like a topic that allowed me to explore lots and lots and lots of different things. And I'm somebody, I get bored quite easily if I'm just doing one thing all the time. I like to jump from one topic to another, and you can do that in philosophy. You can talk about philosophy of mind 1 minute, and then you talk about ethics, and then you talk about the philosophy of science. So you're jumping all over, and philosophy allowed that. And so I think that was probably what got me into it. Maybe I have a bad memory, so I might just be making that up. But yeah.
Or maybe we were spawned 3 seconds ago with all our memories intact.
Exactly.
Who knows? Well, actually, on that note, because I think I've definitely had debates with friends and family at different times. What has your loved ones' reactions and friends' reactions been to your philosophy? Because I remember one time that I was talking to my brother, because I did philosophy as an undergrad, and I went on to do a teaching degree. That's where I got into all of this, and I'm now a teacher of what some people call religious education or religious studies, I think now is the most common nomenclature. And I also teach philosophy at A-level. But when I was studying this in university, I remember saying to my brother one time, you'll get a good laugh out of this, game. We were talking about, is the world real? Like solipsism, is the world real, or am I the only mind? And I was saying this to my brother, he's not philosophically minded, right? My brother is a very intelligent guy, and he runs his own business, and he's very smart in so many ways, but philosophy is just not his interest, which is fair enough. And so I said to him, how do you really know, though? How do you really know that table exists? And what he said to me was, I'll break it over your back, you'll know it'll exist then.
Yeah.
Have you had that kind of reaction when you get into the nitty-gritty with people that you know and love?
I think that the rest of my family wasn't really very academic, to be fair. And so my dad, I think he was very, very sort of practical, practically minded person. And I don't think that he really approved of me doing philosophy. To be honest, I think
I bet not.
I think he saw like, going to university for philosophy is just a sort of way of staying in school and avoiding getting a real job, which, I mean, maybe is true. But,
well, I'm certainly not going to accuse you of that. Goodness, it would be the pot calling the kettle black.
But yeah, so I don't really talk to him about philosophy, really, just because I know it's not something he's interested in. My mum was... very supportive of me, but she didn't have any interest in the field either.
Sure.
And yeah, I think the same goes for my brother, really. As for friends, I don't know how to put this in a way that, like, I don't mean this. I'm not looking for sympathy here, right? But I don't actually have any friends, really. I do now. There's a few people who I would count as friends, but I've never formed close relationships outside of my family. Again, there's a couple of people, but they're both in the field. Like, Cole, for instance, is most certainly a friend, but she's also a philosopher. So,
Well,
yeah.
You know what? I think that experience is pretty common for everybody. I'd be lying right now if I said I had oodles and bunches of friends. I think it depends on how you define friend. you think people are your friends, and then something crap happens in your life and they don't turn up to help you out, And so, yeah, I don't think you're alone there at all. And I think it's amazing when you find acquaintances and friends in a domain that you both have an interest in. So I saw your podcast with Cole when you had Rationality Rules on, and your chemistry and your friendship really shined through in that conversation, and that was awesome. And I can't wait to I hope this conversation blossoms into a friendship. I can't wait to have more friends in the philosophical domain, because one of the things that I'm really starving for, and one of the reasons I'm so happy you're here, is just philosophical conversations like these. I have some friends. I've had a friend, PJ, shout out to PJ, who's been on my channel multiple times, and PJ loves his philosophy like you and I do. And he has actually said to me in the past that if and when he gets an opportunity, what he really wants to do is do exactly what you did, Kane. He wants to go to university and study philosophy at the academic level and at the third level, at the university level. And so, yeah, I just want to have a larger collection. And this is not to disparage any of my friends who are not philosophically minded. I mean, people have different interests, right? But yeah, I mean, I would love to know more people like you who can educate me on this subject and converse with me on this subject, because I have absolutely no doubt, and it's undoubtedly going to happen in this conversation, where I'm going to get things wrong. You're going to give me a different perspective. And what I hope more than anything is that I just learned something from the conversation. Speaking of which, Kane, what is moral realism? Do you want me to explain it? Or I think it might be better for you to explain it, really, because I think you might do a better job than I might do. What is moral realism? How would you define it for a lay audience, shall we say?
Yeah, okay. So I think that, these sorts of terms like realism, anti-realism, I mean, I do want to preface this by saying that you will find different philosophers give different definitions. But I think, generally speaking, moral realism involves, I guess, like three commitments at least. So, first of all, there's a commitment to the idea that when we make moral statements, when I say something like slavery is wrong or abortion is wrong, or whatever, giving to charity is good, just examples, moral statements. What I'm trying to do is I'm attempting to describe facts in the world, so, like, I'm not just trying to express my opinion. I'm trying to get at the truth. Second, there's the claim that some moral statements are indeed true, and then finally, there's a claim that the truth of these moral statements is kind of mind independent or stance independent.
Yes.
Now, we do have to be a little bit careful about how we interpret this, because, if I say that, it's a mind independent fact that slavery is wrong, you might say, well, hang on a minute, surely the wrongness of slavery is going to depend on, the fact that it causes suffering, and that's something in the mind. But what I guess the way to think about this is, if moral realism is right, we might all be mistaken about what the moral facts are. So, even if it were the case that everybody thought that slavery was morally acceptable, and I don't know, maybe there was a time in human history when basically everybody did think slavery was morally acceptable. But even if that were the case, it would still be morally wrong. Yes. So that's kind of the idea, right? Like we don't kind of invent the moral facts, we discover them. So we could all be wrong about them. I think that's what I would consider to be the essential commitments of moral realism. So there are moral facts that we discover. We don't like invent or construct. Does that make sense?
That's perfect, and that maps on to my understanding entirely, actually. So just to throw a curveball, there are some examples of what you and I would agree are immoral instances in human history, just completely abhorrent and despicable, heinous acts. So the Holocaust, for example, right? Mm-hmm. I think, and this was a hurdle for me, which is why I agreed with Sam Harris from the word go when I knew very little, really. I think I know you've said in the past that your intuition never mapped onto this, but my intuition did. When somebody says that the Holocaust is wrong, that the annihilation of 6 million Jewish people is wrong, and that that's not wrong as a matter of mere subjectivity, that it's not wrong as a matter of mere opinion, it's actually really and truly wrong. It's objectively, factually wrong. I suspect, now, I don't have any data to back this up, and I just want to make that clear from the word go, but I imagine that if you were to poll the population on that question, it wouldn't surprise me, and to be honest, even if it went the other way, that it's not necessarily irrelevant, but it wouldn't surprise me if the majority of people in any given population agreed that that is wrong in more than just a subjective or opinionated sense. Mm-hmm. I suspect that a lot of people, if like the vast majority of people, I suspect, would probably say, yeah, no, that's actually just wrong. And if you disagree with that, you're factually incorrect. That it's wrong as a matter of objective, empirical fact, essentially. Mm-hmm. And so I think you and I have the very difficult task in this conversation of trying to convince those people who believe that that's wrong as a matter of fact. We have to try and convince those people that actually, no, it might be wrong, but it can't be wrong in an objective or factual sense. And that might be very counterintuitive for some to suggest, but I think it's important to plant a flag here that neither you or I are suggesting that because it's not objectively wrong, that somehow it's permissible. And that, like, because that's what William Lane Craig and some theists do. I think it's a very dishonest pivot, and I think it reveals them I think it reveals the sophistry for what it is, because I would never suggest in a million years, Kane, nor would you, that the Holocaust is permissible or that it's acceptable. I'm just not willing to make the claim that it's objectively wrong. Yeah, would you agree with everything I've said there?
No, I think the Holocaust was awful, and I very strongly condemn it. But I see this as being an expression of my attitudes, like my emotional commitments, let's say. And I think it's worth pointing out that there are plenty of people who are very firmly on the anti-realist side who, who seem to care a lot about, the way the world is run, and who have very strong moral commitments. There's a philosopher called A.J. Ayer, for instance, who was very firmly anti-realist. Like, he thought that all we're doing when we make moral statements is expressing emotions, right? So, he's an anti-realist, but at the same time, he was, I think, one of the leaders of something, I can't remember what the name was, but it was a Society for Homosexual Law Reform. So this was back in like the 1930s and 40s. And so he was really committed to making the world a better place from the point of view of his own values. Moral anti-realists can have strong moral commitments.
I love that example. That's such sorry to cut across, but I absolutely love that example, because it really does fly in the face of the allegation that anti-realists like you and I are apathetic, or that we're somehow allowing for the abhorrent treatment of individuals, or that, somehow or another we're kind of part of the problem. The Holocaust, because we're not willing to say that the Holocaust is objectively wrong, or because we're not willing to say that the abhorrent treatment of homosexuals is objectively wrong, that somehow we're part of the problem. And yet you have an anti-realist like A.J. Ayer, who was actually at the forefront of trying to assist homosexuals in their, search for equality. Mm-hmm. That's the point you're making, right?
Yeah. I think it might also be worth noting that, there's no reason why. So, in principle, it could be the case that somebody believes that there are objective moral facts, but then just doesn't care. So if you're a moral realist, it seems like you're going to have to acknowledge that. Like, I could believe that, it's objectively wrong for, me to go out mugging people, but so what? I want money. I want money, and so I'm going to go and do it anyway. I mean, I think if you're going to, and if you acknowledge that, then great. I think hopefully you can see that there's no necessary connection between, or really even a correlation between, your commitments with respect to these philosophical questions and, how you behave how you want the world to be.
In other words, being a moral realist is not synonymous with being more moral or being more active in your campaign for equality or prosperity.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. That's such... See, this is why I wanted to have this conversation, because you're just giving me so much ammunition right now. This is awesome. So I would like now, Kane, if you'd permit me to pivot to Sam Harris, who really is at the epicenter of this conversation. For me, I won't say that Sam Harris is at the epicenter of the philosophical conversation in the literature, because, as you've said before and pointed out quite articulately, Sam Harris isn't a central figure in meta-ethics when you study it at the university or PhD level. Is that correct?
Yeah, I never encountered Sam Harris in, like, when I did a course on this. And actually, I mean, Sam Harris himself explicitly distances himself from the field anyway. I can't
in some
exactly
fairly disparaging ways, actually.
Yes. And, you know, so, like, I don't know, maybe he's right. Maybe meta-ethics as a field is just fundamentally confused and misguided. We could all be, you know, wasting our time with this, but, you know, he has kind of planted a flag in that respect. So, yeah. But he's had a lot of influence.
Sorry, finish your talk, Kane.
Yeah, no, I mean, he has had a lot of influence in the wider discourse, let's say.
Yes, in the public, in the layman's domain, you might say, among which I count myself, by the way. I mean, I sometimes refer to myself as a philosopher on my channel, and I guess, just definitionally speaking, I'm philosophizing, but it always rolls off my tongue in a strange way. I don't know if I've earned my stripes yet, we'll put it that way. But Sam Harris, doesn't he say in The Moral Landscape at one point that utterances of the phrase meta-ethics directly contributes to the level of boredom in the universe?
Yes, I think that's how he puts it.
Which is an absolutely shocking thing to say for somebody writing a book which is, at the end of the day, about meta-ethics and how we define what it means to be good or what it is to do good. Oh, it's really painful for me to say these things out loud, because, again, Harris, look, let me just say this before we go any further, because I just want to put all cards on the table, and so people don't just think that this is a Sam Harris hate fest. I absolutely adore Sam Harris. Sam Harris was formative in my transition out of Christianity, and I've made videos on this in the past, and so I won't bore you with the details, dear listener. And Kane, just for, you know, I'll just give you the abridged version. I was arguably creationist in my subservience to Christianity. I had all the arguments off by heart. William Lane Craig and Lee Strobel and people like that were heroes of mine, and I would go out into the world, and while I wasn't a member of any, I was raised Catholic, but I wasn't going out evangelizing on behalf of the Catholic Church, but I would take it upon myself to start up conversations with people and try and convince them of the truth of Christianity, right? So I went from that to being, I think, what Christopher Hitchens called a deeply religious non-believer because of people like Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, and Richard Dawkins. So please don't misunderstand. I have a very special place in my heart for Sam Harris, and I still do. I really, really like him as a person. I just think he's wrong in his moral case. I think he's wrong on the question of moral realism. And so I want to make that clear, because I don't want anybody to think that I'm coming at this from a place of bias and hatred for Sam Harris. I was present at Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson's, I think it was their third dialogue, when they appeared in the 3 Arena in Dublin, Ireland. And I love him. If he was appearing tomorrow here in the UK, I'd go and I'd attend that talk. I love his work. I think he's an awesome human being. Not to say, not least because he's actually quite funny as well. He's quite witty. I think he makes philosophy accessible in lots of ways. But yeah, I just disagree with him on the moral realism front. And evidently, Kane, so do you.
Yeah.
But I don't get the sense that you love Harris like I do. Would that be a fair statement?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, it doesn't. I was never a Christian, and I think that I was also never really that interested in philosophy of religion. I mean, it just always seemed like, I guess my attitude when I was younger was, well, yeah, I mean, obviously, like, there's no reason to believe in God. Let's think about other things. It just wasn't a topic that I was that engaged by. I mean, to be clear, okay, fine, there are sophisticated arguments for it, and there's an interesting debate going on there, but it just wasn't something that really meant that much to me. So I don't really know Sam Harris's work very well. I know about his meta ethics because obviously this is a topic that I'm interested in, and I've encountered him in that context.
So with that said, then let's dive right in and let's look at his actual argument, which thankfully Harris summarized on numerous occasions on Twitter. Obviously, in a conversation like this, we can't just read through the moral landscape. And, guys, if you want to familiarize yourself fully with Sam Harris's moral framework and his so-called moral realism, he claims to be able to prove that moral facts can be known, and this claim is outlined in full in a book known and titled as The Moral Landscape. So if you are interested, you can check out that book. For now, Harris has summarized essentially the central thrust of his position on Twitter. And with Kane here as my partner in crime, we are going to read through these tweets. These tweets are quite old at this point, but obviously I adore this topic, Kane adores this topic, and you might get something out of it. So if you ever thought that moral claims can be factual, this is Sam Harris's case. Kane and I are going to deconstruct it, albeit I'm going to let Kane lead the way on that. That's the reason I've asked him on here today. And, you make up your own mind. I'm never going to tell anybody on this channel what to think. I want people to make up their own minds. And so Kane and I will give you Sam Harris's words here, straight from the horse's mouth, as it were. And Kane, with your assistance, we'll go through this and reveal what, if any, flaws can be found. Is that fair enough?
Yeah. However you want to do it. Let's go ahead.
Awesome. Okay, so tweet 1, getting from is to ought. Oh, goodness. I guess I better clarify quickly. So factual statements are is statements, right? It is the case that, and we'll get to this in a moment, it is the case that when you put your hand on a hot stove, it causes pain. David Hume argued, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, Kane, but Hume argued that you can't get to an ought from an is. That it doesn't matter how many is statements, it doesn't matter how many facts you line up, you can't get from those ises to what one should or shouldn't do about it. My favorite example, which really clicked this into place for me, an example always works to clarify something. My favorite example is the example of the old woman who lives alone. She's got no friends. She's lonely and she's experiencing psychological anguish. She's depressed. She's sad. No one comes to see her, etc., etc. Those are all is statements. It is the case that she's lonely. It is the case that she's sad. It is the case that no one comes to see her, etc., etc., etc. Now, you might be tempted to say, because you're a decent human being, like Kane and I are, you might be tempted to say, so therefore you should go and visit her, or you should go and help her. But the problem is, with those exact same set of ises, you can also justify, therefore we should euthanize her. Is that right, Kane?
Yes, because it depends on what sort of ought claim you want to add to the premises. I mean, if you are coming at this from the point of view of somebody who has egalitarian, compassionate values, then maybe you'll say, well, okay, if this person is depressed and lonely, then we ought to go and help them. But, if you're coming at it from the values of somebody who, I don't know, lived in Sparta or something, then, throw them to the wolves, right? So,
I just got an image of Gerard Butler in 300 kicking the old woman into the well. This is Sparta.
Yeah.
So yeah, that unfortunately there are going to be points of clarification that are required in order to read through these tweets. But that's a fair enough summary of the is-ought distinction. Is that fair, Kane, or is there anything else to add there?
I think that pretty much captures it. Yeah.
Awesome. So Harris claims to be able to solve this problem, because if you could actually get from is to ought, you would have actually arguably demonstrated the existence of moral realism. Is that a fair claim, Kane?
So I mean, obviously, it depends on what the is claims are. I mean, because if the is claim is that God exists, right? Well, maybe you can get to moral realism if you assume that God exists, and you can get over the is-ought gap. Okay, maybe you can do it that way, but maybe we don't want to believe that God exists, right? So it obviously depends on what the is claims are. I would also add, though, I don't actually think that moral realists really need to overcome this problem. I mean, really, the is-ought gap it's a point about the kind of conservativeness of logic. Like in any argument or deductive argument, you're not going to get out more than you put in. So, yes. I can make all sorts of claims about, here's an example, right? I'm not going to get a conclusion about philosophers from premises that don't say anything about philosophers. So if I say, for instance, all men are mortal, therefore all philosophers are mortal, well, actually, that just doesn't follow because, maybe there are philosophers who aren't men, right? I mean, or, humans, I suppose I should, let's be...
I can see that already people watching at home, their minds just blew up when you said that. But I followed it and I know exactly what you mean and I think you're correct.
But so, that maybe there's aliens out there who are immortal, right? Who are also doing philosophy. So... if you want to get to the conclusion that all philosophers are mortal, you're going to have to say something about philosophers in your premises. And so my point would, I'd just be like, okay, it's not really necessary. If you're a moral realist, you don't actually have to get over this problem because you can just assert some moral claims in your premises. But
wouldn't that be putting an ought in the ises, though? How can you tell somebody what they should and shouldn't do without oughts? You've lost me there slightly.
You can't. No, I agree, right? So from a set of ises, you're not going to get an ought claim.
Yes.
But my point is that if you're a moral realist, you don't really need to. You can just have an ought in there. You can just say something like, well, we ought to. To help people. We ought to be compassionate.
Because the ought itself is self-justifying in a way. Is that what you mean?
Well, obviously, there would be a further argument about why we think this is true.
Yes. That makes perfect sense, because the moral realist is trying to argue from the word go that the oughts themselves are facts. So you don't need ises, really, to govern them. You could argue that the ought itself is a fact in and of itself, or that is maybe... Am I on the right track there, or have I missed the point?
Yeah, so I think you're on the right track. I think that again, compare it to the argument about philosophers, right?
Yes.
So if I don't say something about philosophers in the premises, I can't say anything about philosophers in the conclusion.
Sure.
But that doesn't mean that I have to be like an anti-realist about philosophers. I can believe that there are philosophers in the world, right? I can think that there are like facts about, whether or not someone is a philosopher, facts about what philosophers do. It's just that if I don't say anything about philosophers, I'm not going to be able to get a conclusion about philosophers.
Sean Carroll put this point to Sam Harris on stage at a conference when he was challenging Harris. He said that as just the mere facts of logic, it's garbage in, garbage out. Right? You cannot have a conclusion that was not already in your axioms, that was not already in the argument to begin with. So, yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. But Harris might actually agree with you here, Kane, because, and perhaps I'm putting the cart before the horse here. We'll get back to Harris's tweets in one moment just to clarify for the audience. But Harris himself actually says, let's just pretend that there aren't any oughts. Right. He says that maybe we don't even need oughts. All we need is ises. And I think I know what he means by that. And I want to put that to you when we get to the challenges stage. So I'll put a pin in that for now. Yeah. And I think it might be best to get back to the tweets. Is that okay with you?
Yeah. So,
awesome. I just wanted to ask, just in case there's anything else you wanted to add before we proceed.
No, let's go ahead.
Awesome. So getting from is to ought, Harris says in the first tweet, number one, let's assume that there are no oughts or shoulds in this universe. There is only what is, the totality of actual and possible facts. Do you have any problem with that statement? I don't. I mean, if he's just saying for the sake of argument, let's assume there's no oughts, fine. And that all that exists is the totality of actual and possible facts. Is there a problem that you would raise with the first tweet?
There's nothing I disagree with there.
Nor I.
So, I'm happy to move on from that. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so let's move to tweet number 2 then. Among the myriad things that exist are conscious minds, susceptible to a vast range of actual and possible experiences. Again, I would agree with that. Any objections, Kane?
I don't have any objections to that, no.
Coolio.
Right.
I
think that's actually quite controversial. I mean, there are philosophers who would disagree, but I'm not among them.
Yeah, I know exactly. So a solipsist would disagree there, right? Sure. Let's go with number 3 then. So you and I agree with that, so let's move on. Number 3. Unfortunately, many experiences suck. I suspect we're about to run into problems here. Unfortunately, many experiences suck, and they don't suck as a matter of cultural convention or personal bias. They really and truly suck. If you doubt this, place your hand on a hot stove and report back. Now, I suspect that the majority of people watching my channel right now, and I will have put this tweet on the screen so they can read it for themselves. I suspect that the majority of people watching my channel right now are probably going to say, yeah, I don't see any problem with that. It is true that it would suck if I put my hand in a hot stove. But I suspect, Kane, that you have problems with this particular tweet. Would I be right in saying that?
I mean, the concern that I have, I suppose it's like one of those things where, this is open to different interpretations, and
sure.
What Harris wants to do with this claim later in the argument, I have problems with. I mean, obviously, I completely agree, right? Like, we have all sorts of different experiences. I have a positive response to some of them, a negative response to other ones. That's absolutely true. If I put my hand on a hot stove, then I certainly don't want that, right? Like, I don't want my hand to be put on a hot stove. Yeah. But when we say that some experiences suck, I'm inclined to say, okay, sucks for who, right? Because it's one thing to say that, I personally do not like this experience. It's another thing to say that there's some sense in which it objectively sucks, or in which the suckiness is kind of not dependent on anybody's values. I mean, maybe the way to think about this is yeah, when I put my hand on the hot stove, that really sucks for me. Why would it have to suck for anybody else? It seems like somebody could observe what I'm doing, recognize that I'm experiencing enormous suffering, but either not care or maybe even find it good. I mean, you might experience schadenfreude at me doing something stupid, like putting my hand on a hot stove.
Absolutely. Taking pleasure in the misery of others. Yeah.
Exactly. You might find it intellectually interesting. Maybe, you're a psychologist or something who's, observing people's reactions to things, and you don't really care about the suffering. You just want to know how the human mind works and how the human body works.
Those damn evil psychologists.
So, yes, it sucks for me, but it maybe doesn't suck for you. And if we want to claim that one of those assessments is objectively correct, then we're going to have a bit more work to do. So I would just. Yeah, I would point that out.
I can already see people screaming at the screen and saying, but there isn't a person who enjoys putting their hand on the hot stove, Kane. Why would you say that? Clearly, it's true that no matter who you are, irrespective of where you're born, no matter what part of the world, rich, poor, skinny, overweight, it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter what your skin color is, doesn't matter where you're from, it's irrespective, it's all irrelevant. If you put your hand on a hot stove, it's going to suck, it's going to hurt. And this is, and you correct me if I'm wrong here again, Ken, but my one of the reasons I have become dissuaded by this argument is that it seems that Harris is using the word objective, whereas he should actually be using the word universal.
Yeah.
So it is a fact that it might, and it's not a fact that all people would experience it the same, actually, because if you've got a condition, if you put a paraplegic's hand on the hot stove, they're not going to feel anything. Right? So no, not even every person, but even if we steelman the proposition and just grant it for the sake of argument, let's imagine it sucks for every single human when they put their hand on a hot stove. That doesn't mean that we objectively, it's objectively true that it sucks to put your hand on a hot stove. It just means that it's a universal experience that it sucks to put your hand on a hot stove. Because objective does that make sense? Am I on the right track there?
Yeah, I think it does. I actually think we can probably steelman it a bit more because, I mean, ultimately the hot stove example doesn't really matter. I think that what Harris seems to be getting at is, look, everybody is kind of structured in such a way psychologically that there are certain experiences they want and certain experiences they don't want. Yes. Now, maybe you're a masochist and you actually like putting your hand on a hot stove. I mean, that's possible. But even so, even for those people, there's going to be some things that they just don't want to happen. So, and that's totally true. I mean, there's no question about that. But I don't think that you're getting any kind of objective value from that, because there's still a question of why should I believe that it's in some sense objectively good or bad? Somebody could hold that it's objectively good to just bring about suffering in others. I mean, maybe they really like bringing about suffering in others, in which case they would have a very good reason from their point of view to put everybody's hands on hot stoves and so on.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The analogy I've heard used, and again, this analogy was quite helpful for me understanding this point, because I was one of those people screaming at the screen saying things like, but it doesn't matter what culture you're from. It doesn't matter what part of the world you're living in. It doesn't matter who you are. When your hand is put on a hot stove, it really and truly sucks, to use Harris's words. So isn't it the case that we ought not to? And there's where he's trying to get from his is to his ought, right? But the analogy that really helped me understand it was the analogy of color. If we imagined a parallel reality, a parallel universe, where everybody agreed that red is the best color, just everybody agreed that red is the best color, but what color you prefer is still a preference. Just because every single person on the planet agrees that red is the best color doesn't elevate that preference from a preference to a moral fact. Right? It doesn't elevate that preference beyond a preference. It's still just a preference. It's just a preference that everybody shares. It's universal. It doesn't make it objective. The only thing that's objectively true there is that everybody has the preference. It doesn't make the preference itself objectively true. So even though in that universe, when we ask ourselves, what color car should I buy? People will naturally and presumably suggest that you buy a red one, because everybody in that universe has the subjective preference that red is the best color. But that doesn't mean that you ought buy a red car. And it certainly doesn't mean that if you do buy a red car that you have engaged in something that's objectively true. It means that you acted on a subjective preference that everybody just happens to have. Does that make sense, Kane?
Yeah, I think that's a good analogy. And I mean, this does, I should just note, kind of relate back to what we were saying about how earlier about how moral anti-realists can still have very strong moral commitments. I mean, as a moral anti-realist, I want it to be the case. I would rather live in a world where everybody recognizes that some people can experience bad things, some people can suffer, and it would be a good thing if we tried to reduce that, right? I want it to be, I don't know. I also kind of like engaging with wild ideas, but basically there is a part of me, let's say, that wants it to be the case that everybody just agrees, okay, pain is bad. Let's do what we can to reduce pain. That seems like a good, a good thing. It would be good if everybody agreed on that. And so, merely the fact that that a particular view is universal doesn't mean that we have to be committed to its being objective.
Yeah, because objectivity isn't decided by consensus or democracy, right?
Not usually. I mean, whether or not Mount Everest is the tallest mountain on Earth isn't a matter of whether we all agree that it is, you know?
Yeah. So. I mean, my favorite example is, maybe everybody is a stretch, but again, let's just say for the sake of argument, at one point in history, everybody believed the Earth was flat. And yet that had no relationship to the truth of the matter. And, we all now believe, at least most of us, with the exception of the Flat Earth Society, we now all believe that the Earth is spherical. And, we might discover that we're wrong and that we're just all subject to a very powerful optical illusion or something, right? But the point is that the truth, or what's objectively true, has no relationship to democracy or consensus. The majority may be correct, but if they're correct, it's not because they're the majority. They're correct because, well, empirically speaking, the evidence supports their perspective. That depends, of course, if you're an empiricist, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so, when we reread this tweet, this is really helping me clarify my thoughts, Kane. This is awesome. So when Sam Harris says, unfortunately, many experiences suck, and they don't just suck as a matter of cultural convention or personal bias. That's true. They really and truly suck. That's also true. But as you alluded to, Kane, Harris is going to try and use this claim to erect a moral realist position later on. And I'm convinced, and it sounds like you agree it is actually a compelling problem, which is really exciting that you actually agree with that. But it sounds like you agree that the problem is that he is assuming here that universality is actually a synonym for objective.
I think that's... It seems to me there's two things going on. One of those is that, but I think there's also kind of an equivocation, let's say, on the term suck. So because suck, when you say that some experiences suck, you could just be talking about the sort of first personal feelings. Like, I put my hand on the hot stove, I feel pain, and I don't want to feel pain, right? Or you could be using that as a assessment of value, right? Like, And in that case, like, me feeling pain, the fact that I feel pain, I mean, I think that's a bad thing, but there's no reason. I mean, there's no reason why even I would have to think that's a bad thing. In principle, I could have the desire to bring about as much pain as possible in myself. That would be very, very unusual, but it's not impossible. But certainly, if you look at it from the point of view of other people, there's no reason why other people would have to care whether or not I'm experiencing pain. So we have to be quite careful when we say, like, some experiences suck. It is absolutely true that there are experiences that kind of feel bad from the inside. It doesn't mean that there's some sort of like objective value, or that we're objectively, like an objective ought, that we ought to avoid those experiences.
Yes, and there are some very interesting examples where we choose not to choose inverted commas. My viewers are saturated with me talking about determinism, so they know what I mean when I say choose inverted commas. But yeah, I mean, aren't there cases where somebody volunteers for pain to save a child? Aren't there situations where somebody sacrifices themselves for some noble purpose? How do those work in the face of this idea that we just ought to avoid that which causes us pain and suffering? Would I be right in saying that kind of muddles the picture?
I think it does, although I don't know if that's really a problem for Harris, because I mean he's gonna want to say, well, there are trade-offs, right? So yes, I mean, maybe I experience negative feelings when I have a needle go in my arm, but the benefits of being vaccinated against diseases far outweigh that. I mean, ultimately,
yes.
I'm avoiding more suffering in the long run. And we can sort of view the same, we can look at that as on a sort of societal level. Like, we put people in prison, that imposes suffering on them. But, we do it, the reason why we put people in prison is because that makes most of us better off in the long run, to have them separated. So that muddles it, but I think that's a point that, he has a pretty plausible response to.
Fair. Yeah. Well, I was going to say, I have no doubt that moral realists have responses to all these claims. And, you know, it has to be said that this conversation isn't going to serve as a knockdown argument against moral realism, because if we had a moral realist in this conversation with us right now, they'd have responses for all of this stuff, which is why I said from the outset to the audience, don't just assume that moral realism is flawed and nonsense just because Kane and I happen to agree that it's not, that it doesn't stand up to scrutiny. You got to make up your own mind here, but I'm pretty convinced at this point. But let's continue into tweet number 4, Kane. So Harris says, conscious minds are natural phenomena. There's, again, philosophers who'll disagree with that. Consequently, if we were to learn everything there is to know about physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, economics, etc., we would know everything there is to know about making our corner of the universe suck less. How do you feel about that one?
So again, if we're thinking of this idea that some experiences suck just in terms of like how they feel from the inside, then that seems perfectly reasonable. Like the more we learn about how humans work, the more we learn about what sorts of things we can do and ways of structuring society so as to, you know, bring about certain states. I mean, we don't really need to get into the physics and biology and so on. Like, we know that if we round up, to take a Holocaust, round up millions of people and put them in gas chambers, that's going to create enormous amounts of suffering. So
yes,
and that I think is, again, if we understand that term "suck" to just describe experiences and how they feel.
Yeah. So, yeah, conscious minds are natural phenomena. I mean, I agree with that, but I mean,
I'm just putting aside those sorts of.
Sure. Yeah. Just for the sake of expediency. Yeah, I was just going to say, I was just going to point out. I mean, I agree with that because I'm what you might call a methodological naturalist. I'm not claiming that all that exists is the natural world, but I act as though that's the case because I don't see any compelling evidence for anything more than that. Consequently, if we were to learn everything there is to know about physics, chemistry, biology, blah, 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 we would know everything there is to know about making our corner of the universe suck less. I guess I would just grant that for the sake of conversation. Are you happy to proceed on that basis, Kane?
Yeah.
I mean, again, there's a million things we could say about all of these, but just to get to the center of the bullseye here, because I think here's where number 5, and we're almost there. There's 8 of these in total, but number 5 is where Harris, I think, stakes his claim. He says, and I quote, "If we should do anything in this life, we should avoid what really and truly sucks. If you consider this question begging, consult your stove as above." And if you'll permit me, Kane, I think this is just bad philosophy.
Yeah.
Really. I mean, first of all, and this is one of my criticisms, right? When he starts the tweet with if we should do anything, is this not just a repackaging of the Kantian hypothetical imperative? Kant famously said that, if X, kind of therefore Y, right? If you want to maximize well-being, therefore you shouldn't put your hand on a hot stove. But the if is still subjective. It's only if you want to maximize your well-being, you shouldn't put your hand on the hot stove. And Harris here is using if. It's almost like he acknowledges that what he's saying here can't be rationalized or justified as an objective ought. He says, if we should do anything in this life, we should avoid what really and truly sucks. But the very thing he's trying to argue in favor of is that there isn't an if here. He's trying to argue for moral realism, that there is a moral and factual should, which pertains to avoiding what really and truly sucks. Am I wrong here, Kane? Have I missed the point here?
I mean, so okay. I haven't actually looked at the tweets. Does he kind of discharge that if at the end? I'm not actually sure.
He says, I'll read it again. I don't know
how he does it.
So he says, and I quote, "If we," and he puts should with 2 stars next to it. I call them stars. Yeah. What would you call them?
Asterisks.
An asterisk. Thank you. Yes. I was drawing a blank there. So he says, if we asterisk should do anything in this life, we should avoid what really and truly sucks. Parentheses, If you consider this question begging, consult your stove as above. But as I pointed out, and as you agreed already, Kane, the stove example serves to prove nothing other than the universality of our agreement that something sucks. That doesn't produce an objective ought or a moral fact. Again, am I wrong here?
No, I think you're right. I'm just looking at this, and it's so because there's nothing in principle wrong with framing an argument and including a conditional claim. You know, if P then Q. What's very strange is that I don't know how he's discharging the conditional. So I don't know how, because you don't just want to say, you know, if P is the case, then we should do this. You want to get to the conclusion P is the case. But he doesn't seem to actually make any move that achieves that. So no, you're right. Actually, yeah, that's a really weird way of structuring the argument. I don't know if maybe maybe we can sort of steel man it so that
please do, because I'm honestly at a loss. I'm honestly at a loss. So if you can steel man it and salvage it, that would be hugely valuable.
I'm not actually sure how I would go about doing that. I feel like what he wants to. I feel like what he wants to be concluding at this point is just that there are some things we should be doing, you know, in this life, namely,
as a matter of fact,
you know, yeah. But yeah, that's weird.
It really is bizarre. I think, look, it might be a good time. I planted a flag earlier in the conversation. It might be a good time to raise that flag. I've had this conversation in depth with numerous people at this point, largely in my own personal life. And there's a couple of people, like I said, I've got just a couple of friends who are interested in philosophy, and I've hashed this out with them multiple times. And one of them pointed out to me that it's actually not a repackaging of the Kantian hypothetical imperative, because there actually is no if. It simply is the case that human beings want to move from what is considered bad to what is considered good. It simply is the case that we want to avoid suffering. And because it is the case that we want to avoid suffering, therefore we should. But then that is just another example of trying to get from an is to an ought, where it commits that logical mistake of assuming that you've gotten something from your logic that wasn't there in the opening of the argument. Because again, as Sean Carroll put it, it's garbage in, garbage out. So how can you get to it is the case that suffering sucks or suffering is bad or that humans want to avoid suffering to therefore we ought to? I think Harris is suggesting that there is no ought. It's just a case that we do avoid it. That's what he said to Sean Carroll on stage. He said, there's no place you can stand outside of this claim. It is the fact that if you put your hand on the hot stove, you would feel a very strong desire to get away from it. And he seems to be erecting the case that that's all we need, that it is the fact that human beings want to get away from excruciating agony. And so that's just what we do.
Yeah, I mean, well, actually, Harris is right about that. I think that is all we need. It's just that then you're a moral anti-realist. So, I mean,
oh my God!
We don't actually. It's like, yeah, I mean, humans have these drives and desires and emotional reactions. There are things we like and things we don't like, and you know, there's a process of negotiation there because obviously our desires come into conflict. Maybe I want something you have. But like I know that if I was to just steal it, then you know I could get punished, etc. Right? So there's all of this kind of negotiation going on, and on that basis we develop moral norms.
Are you saying, Kane? Are you suggesting? How dare you? Are you suggesting that Sam Harris is an anti-realist and he doesn't know it?
I mean, if that was how he responded to that point, then yeah, I think that. That sounds like exactly what an anti-realist would say.
It does, doesn't it? And upon reflection, when you said it, like when I burst into laughter because if I didn't, I think I was just going to cry, because that is actually quite a profound response. So if my interpretation, and indeed my friend's interpretation, is correct, if it is the case that all Harris is saying is that it's not possible to stand outside of the fact that putting your hand on a hot stove sucks, because everybody agrees that sucks. It's maybe perhaps Harris himself says that the word should is misused and that the word ought is misused, which is why I think he begins this Twitter thread by saying, let's imagine that there are no oughts or shoulds. ought and should, in Harris's view, and I'm trying to steelman it here, but I think what he's saying is, Kane, that oughts and shoulds are synonymous with the simple human desire to want to avoid the worst possible misery for everyone, which is what the thought experiment that Harris often uses. He says, if you can concede that the worst possible misery for everyone is bad, then we're just at an impasse. And I would agree that the worst possible misery for everyone is bad, because no conscious creature wants to experience the worst possible misery. But then we're just back to universality, not objectivity. But Harris is saying that that's all we've got. It is just true that conscious creatures want to avoid the worst possible misery, and that's how we should kind of redefine what ought is. Ought is simply that which is in accordance with what we don't want to happen. Do you think that's what he's doing? And is that a reasonable pivot? Is that a reasonable move?
I mean, he might be doing that. I'm not sure. So Harris he's certainly some sort of, like, he wants to be a kind of naturalist about this. He wants to say that moral values, they're not these kind of spooky, abstract things, right? They're just kind of natural properties. And so, yeah, I mean, he might be doing that. The problem I have with this is that I think that when we make moral claims, one of the problems that I have with realism in general, but one of the issues I would have with this attempt to redefine moral claims, is that it seems to me to miss or fail to capture what I think is a kind of central feature of moral claims, which is moral claims. They're supposed to be providing, moral properties are supposed to be providing constraints on our action or reasons for actions that are independent of our own personal desires.
Yes.
So, like, I might well desire to own lots of slaves, right? But I still ought not to do it. It would be morally wrong for me to do it. And if you imagine sort of saying, well, why shouldn't I own slaves? If you were to say, well, you shouldn't own slaves because it's illegal and you'll get punished. I mean, that may be true, but if you're trying to forward a moral argument, it kind of misses the point, right?
Absolutely.
It's like it's perfectly fine for reasons for action to be kind of dependent on desire. Like, I can say, if you want to warm up, you should light a fire, or if you don't want to get wet, you should put on a coat. Morality has a kind of degree of authority that is greater than that, right? It's not just a matter of, well, if you want to achieve X, you should do Y. Because maybe, like, I want to impose suffering on people. And if I want to impose suffering on people, then a way to achieve that would be to force everybody's hands onto hot stoves.
Yes.
But we don't want to, we don't want to have that conclusion, right? So
you're saying the hypothetical imperative is not really morality?
No, I don't think so. I think it attempting to redefine morality in those terms just misses the practical authority of morality, or again, like, so we philosophers draw this distinction between hypothetical and categorical reasons. The idea of morality, I think, is that it's supposed to provide categorical reasons for action, where these are desire-independent reasons for action. Like, there are certain things that it would be wrong for me to do, or that I ought not to do, no matter what my personal goals are.
Yes, that makes sense to me. And suffice to say, you don't think that there are any categorical imperatives?
No, certainly no categorical reasons for action. No.
Yeah, and nor do I. And Harris seems to be trying to erect the idea that there are categorical imperatives, or things that are simply right and wrong, irrespective, or things that are right and wrong and are truly objectively right and wrong, regardless of whether or not we think they are right or wrong. But then, in a strange move, he seems to try to locate that within our very own preference, as he calls it himself, a navigation problem, that we want to get from that which sucks to that which is awesome. But that is locating morality within preference. And as you said, locating morality within preference isn't really morality at all. If anything, a better definition of morality is what we ought to do regardless of our preferences. Is that right, Kane?
Yeah, again, you do have to be a little bit careful with how you interpret that, because obviously, I mean, any moral realist will want to say that it matters how people's reactions to things matter to whether or not something is morally right or wrong. So the fact that putting my hand on a hot stove or forcing me to put my hand on a hot stove would cause me to suffer is obviously relevant to the fact that it's morally wrong. But again, it's if you look at this from the point of view, just try looking at it from the point of view of somebody with a very different psychology, right? I think that might help, right? Imagine looking at this from the point of view of a psychopath who enjoys imposing suffering.
Yes.
We want to say to that person, no, you ought not to impose suffering on other people. You ought not to do that, even though it's something you desire. There's still some further sense in which you ought not to do it, and that's where the moral ought is, I think.
Yes. And suffice to say, you and I don't believe that there's any objectively existing moral ought. There's no categorical imperative that we could use to convince that psychopath that they ought not to do that. Yeah. As moral anti-realists, this is something I wanted to get to. As moral anti-realists, there are, however, other methods that we could use to dissuade the psychopath from harming other people, right?
Yeah. And well, I don't know if do we want to talk about that now, or
well, yeah. I was going to say, let's plant a flag there, because we'll get to it in a moment. Let's finish with the tweets first. I think that's quite a good shout, Kane. So we were on tweet 5, which, let's just say, it's difficult to quantify what he's going for there. I think we've discussed it enough where people can make up their own minds. Tweet 6 says, and I quote, "Of course, we can be confused or mistaken about experience. Something can suck for a while, only to reveal new experiences which don't suck at all. On these occasions, we say at first that sucked, but it was worth it." I don't see any reason to disagree here. Do you find any problem with this?
No, I don't. I don't think this is really essential to his argument anyway.
It's so bizarre.
Yeah. So
why did he choose this as a premise? Look, again, I'm trying to word my responses here in such a manner that they're respectful, because like I said, I love Sam Harris, but I do scratch my head when I read some of these tweets and think, why is this part of the argument? So let's read number 7, and I quote, "We can also be selfish and short-sighted. Many solutions to our problems are zero-sum. My gain will be your loss. But better solutions aren't. By what measure of better? Fewer things suck." Do you have anything to add there, Kane?
Not really. I don't think this is all that essential to the overall point he's making. So,
So let's get to the crescendo then. His almighty pièce de résistance. Number 8, and I quote, "So what is morality? What ought sentient beings like ourselves do? Understand how the world works, facts, so that we can avoid what sucks, values." I leave it to you. I leave it to you to tell us what is the matter with that statement, Kane. Please.
Okay. Well, I guess there's a lot to be said. I think that we've already kind of covered some of it, but there is one very important point that I did want to make about what he's trying to do here. So I think that he's just fundamentally missing a very, very important step in this whole argument. So what he's done is, again, he's tried to show how we can get from facts to values. Now, let's say we just accept everything he said, right? Suppose we accept that there are objective values. I actually don't think you get moral realism from this. And the reason why is that just because there are objective values doesn't mean that there are objective oughts. So we mentioned this point earlier about there being an is-ought gap. I think in the same way, and I should say this is a little bit more controversial among philosophers, I think there's a value-ought gap. So maybe a good way to see this is, even once you've established what the values are,
what you're going to do about them, right? Is that where you're going with this? Yes. Sorry to interject. I just wanted to see if I was on the same kind of stream with you there. So
there's
please
a question
continue
about how you act with respect to the values. And So one, I mean, again, there's lots of debates about how we act with respect to values, but a distinction I really like is philosophers sometimes draw this distinction between promoting values and honouring values. So
Yes.
suppose I take it to be the case that like killing is wrong, right? So I maybe just I consider life to be a value, right? I want to like I think that's a good thing, and I take it to be objectively good. It's an objective fact that like life is good. So if I am somebody who is promoting the value of life, then I will, in my actions, do whatever I can to just maximize life. So if you imagine, to take a classic philosophical example, imagine there's like, 5 people tied to a track, and then, there's a very large person. I could push the large person in front of a trolley that's coming down that would otherwise kill the 5 people. I mean, that's quite a wild example, I know. But, if I'm promoting the value of life, then that's what I'll do, right? I'll push that person, and that will kill 1 person to save 5. Alternatively,
but if you're honouring it.
If I'm honouring it, if I'm honouring the value, then that means that in my own actions,
you can't push him.
I will not do anything that that involves violation of like the right to life or something like that. I won't kill people in my own actions. So okay, we've got an objective fact about what the value is, right? The objective value is life is good, but how do you act with respect to that? Do you promote or do you honor? There's a further step there.
I hope it's not too early to say in our relationship, but I bloody love you, I swear to God. I have to tell you, and I intentionally didn't tell you this before we started filming, but this was the argument that changed my mind.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, this was the exact argument when you used this when you had your conversation with Rationality Rules, when you and Cole, wasn't it?
Yeah.
You and Cole had your conversation with Rationality Rules, and you introduced this so-called value ought gap, and whether or not we should promote. Let's just grant, like you said, let's just steelman the proposition. Let's imagine it is a categorical imperative. It is an objective fact that we ought not murder. You still have the value ought problem about whether or not you promote that value or honor that value, which gives you mutually contradictory results.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't, like, even if there were moral imperatives, you haven't solved the problem. And again, I have to give you credit. I have to say this because this is the thing that changed my mind. This was where the penny dropped, and I was sitting there with my laptop. I often get into bed and I sit there on my laptop on my tummy, and I was watching, and I sat up in the bed and I took off my headphones. I swear, like I had an actual profound moment, and I just thought to myself, I'm not a moral realist anymore. I felt the epiphany. I was like, I don't agree with Sam Harris anymore. Like this is such a good argument, Kane. And forgive me, I know I interjected there. Was there anything else you wanted to add to that puzzle to complete it? Because I just wanted to give you credit where credit is due.
No, that was it. That was the point. And I mean, it's really great to hear. I mean, it's always great to hear when people are responsive to arguments. Because, well, it's very rare, isn't it, that people just change their mind as a result of arguments. But
yes,
that's wonderful. I'm glad to have had a positive influence, or maybe a negative influence, because we might both be wrong. So I could have misled you.
And you ought to not mislead people, Kane.
Yeah.
2 hours later.
So, Kane, thus far, I think, if you'll permit me for patting myself and you on the back, I think we've done a pretty okay job of outlining what moral realism is. I think we've done a good job of advertising and talking through Sam Harris's particular case for moral realism. I think we've pointed out some flaws in it. Again, the viewer can make up their own mind whether or not they think we've been persuasive, and perhaps they'll decide at the end of the day that we've gotten it wrong and the anti-realist position is garbage and that realism is the path forward. But with that in mind, what I would like to do, just in the interest of fairness, and I'm all in favor of steel manning and always erecting the best possible version of your opponent's argument so that we don't get accused of being unfair. And so what I've got I've literally written in my notes here, challenges for Kane. But they're in equal measure, they're challenges for me, because I've obviously admitted in this conversation and elsewhere that I am an anti-realist and that I agree with you. So I've written down, to the best of my ability, 5 challenges that Sam Harris supporters, or, maybe moral realists more generally, might raise. And if you want to add some other challenges to the list as we go that you'd like to steel man and address, I'd be very happy for you to do that as well. So I've mined these responses from Harris himself. So in preparation for this conversation, I've sat down and I've watched a bunch of Harris's responses to people challenging him on his moral and ethical framework. One of the conversations was with Sean Carroll, for example. And this is what I could come up with. This is the best I could come up with. That doesn't mean that this is the best Harris has to say on the subject. I just want that to be clear. I don't want anybody to have the misapprehension that I'm suggesting that these are the best defenses of his moral realism. They're just a selection. It's not an exhaustive list. I'm not even claiming that they're the best defenses, which is why I'm asking you, Kane, if you know of any others after we've gone through this list, you can feel free to add them and we can discuss those as well. Is that fair enough?
Yeah.
Awesome. So challenge 1 is a challenge that Harris often issues to interlocutors when they disagree with him on his moral realism. He says, the worst possible misery for everyone is bad. If bad means anything, that's bad. And of course, he would add to that it's bad as a matter of fact, that it's an imperative. It's just imperatively true. It is a moral imperative. It is factually, objectively true that the worst possible misery for everyone is bad. How do you, Kane, an anti-realist, respond to that claim?
In some ways, I think we've kind of covered this when I talked about how, when he says some experiences suck, right? There's a danger of equivocating on the word suck. I mean, obviously, if you imagine a world in which there are just millions of people in kind of constant pain and torture, yes, I mean, for all of those people, that's going to be very unpleasant. That's going to be bad for them, given what they want. But I mean, I just don't see, again, like merely from that fact alone, I don't think you're going to get to a claim that it's like objectively bad. Again, what if I'm a sort of person who wants to impose suffering on people and I enjoy that? What if I'm a sadist, right? In that case, the worst possible misery for all of those people, I'm going to think that's a good thing. Of course, I wouldn't like it if I was undergoing pain and suffering as well. But maybe in that world where there's, everybody else suffering, maybe the very fact that everyone else is suffering makes me feel a little bit better. So, if I'm a sadist about it. So, yeah, I think it's the same kind of problem when we say that some experiences suck. I think that answers it. Does it?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good response. I think, again, would I be correct in saying that he's making the same mistake here of equating universality with objectivity? Because yes, in that reality, it would be true to say that the universal experience is one of pain and misery, but it wouldn't follow that therefore it's objectively bad. It's just bad as a matter of universal experience, right? Is that another fair response?
Yeah, and I mean, certainly, I can, if I was in that world, I would be doing everything I could to encourage people to structure things in a different way so that we're not all in constant misery. But we only need our values and the things we care about to do that.
Which is kind of, as you pointed out, what Harris is saying anyway, which makes him, in your view, and I guess now in mine, a kind of unintentional anti-realist in a way.
Yeah, I think actually there was one other thing. So I guess, I don't know if it was exactly a quote, but you said, if bad means anything, it must be that this is bad, or it was something like that. It's
right? At the tail end of this. Yeah. So let me reread it to you. He says, the worst possible misery for everyone is bad. If bad means anything, that's bad.
So one thing I would say is that when we think about these terms like good and bad and other moral terms like, ought and should and so on, I think that what's kind of the meaning of those terms is sort of governed a lot more by, like, how should I put this? So when we say that something is good, I think that what's being expressed there is that this is something that we are pursuing, that we will encourage other people to pursue, that we maybe, condemn or punish people if they fail to pursue it. So, when I say like X is good, it means like I'm pursuing X. I'm encouraging other people to pursue X. I'm condemning people who don't pursue X. I mean, if you like imagine let's say we just find some small scale society, some other tribe somewhere, and this tribe has seemingly totally different values to us, right? Like this, that they have some word, maybe not good, maybe call it gloop, right? And they say that for them, gloop, right? When they say that like X is gloop things are things that involve like violence and aggression and competition and selfishness and so on. So for them, like when you, I don't know, see a weak person and you recognize them as a weak member of the tribe, you stab them and take their stuff, they say that's gloop. And but right, they're all like encouraging people to do that, right? And they praise people who stab the weak, and they punish people who fail to like stab the weak or who aren't aggressive enough, and so on. So imagine this. So this is a tribe where, like, now what I would say is that it seems to me that if we were to translate that word gloop, we'd just translate it as good. That's what they're saying, right? They're saying that it is good to be aggressive and violent and selfish and so on. And so I think when we're thinking about the meaning of moral terms, I would look more to the way in which they kind of govern our action. Like, we are inclined to do things that we take to be good, and inclined to avoid things that we take to be bad. So in that respect, I just disagree with Harris on this point. I think actually that we can give the meaning of terms like good and bad in a way that's independent of any particular moral content. I don't know if I expressed that very well, but
are you kind of driving at the naturalistic fallacy where people are associating goodness or badness with some kind of naturalistic property? Or is it the exact opposite you're articulating, where the desire to associate these things with naturalistic properties might actually be a mistake? Am I in the ballpark there, or have I missed the point?
I guess it's kind of maybe similar to that. I mean, it's just like, so Harris seems like what he might be saying there is that if you don't say that the world of millions of people in misery is bad, then the word just has no meaning.
Yes.
And I'm disagreeing with that, right? Like, I'm saying, actually, like, what's really like meant when we say X is bad is
I see.
Like, X is something we want to avoid. X is something we desire. Like, we punish people who engage in X behavior. It's more that kind of thing. And
so bad is just being defined as that which is against our preference. So we're back to preference again.
Well, it seems to me that that's playing a pretty essential role in how we're actually using those terms.
Yes. And you, or at least the person who believes in moral imperatives, or even as you pointed out, morality, if it should be defined as anything, what's right and wrong or what's good and bad, if they should be defined as anything, should be defined in such a manner that our preferences actually don't, or at least don't factor in the largest manner, right? If anything, morality should be defined as acting against your preferences, depending on the context.
Yeah. At the very least, like, to say that something is good or bad, it's like you're not just acting on your personal desires. It's not just a matter of how to best achieve what you personally desire.
Yes, yes. No, that makes sense. Because my problem with this, right, and maybe this is wrong-headed of me, because when I read this statement, the worst possible misery for everyone is bad. If bad means anything, that's bad, right? But Sam Harris is using bad kind of as a synonym for pain, which means that this statement becomes, and misery, let's face it, is another synonym for pain, which means the statement becomes the worst possible pain for everyone is painful. Is that, like, is this not just circular as well, or do you think that's an unfair characterization of the statement?
I mean, it's difficult to know because he might have more to say, which
Sure.
would, so I don't know if I would want to make any judgment about that.
No, that's totally fair.
Yeah.
That's totally fair. And I did raise that point earlier. We don't have Harris here or any other moral realist here to defend the other side of the fence. And so we do need to be measured in our attack and interpretation of various points. And so I do appreciate your kind of hesitancy there, Kane. No, that makes perfect sense.
I would say this: if you think that all that we're really expressing when we say that something is bad is that it produces suffering or it produces pain or something like that, then yes, that claim is just a tautology.
Yes.
But obviously all of the action in metaethics is like, well, should we accept that, right? I mean, is that really all that we're saying when we say that something is bad? Yeah.
Perfect. No, that sounds good. So challenge number 2, we've already addressed. I wrote down, and of course I didn't know what direction the conversation was going to go as and when we were having it, but challenge number 2 was the Holocaust is wrong, is only an opinion. And I think we've addressed that in full. Do you want to just give a quick Passover, no pun intended. Do you want to quickly run back over that again, just briefly, and like just the abridged bullet point version? Why is the Holocaust is wrong not a fact? Why is it just a subjective statement in your view as an anti-realist?
Because I don't think there are objective moral facts. In a sense, I mean, I would agree that to say that the Holocaust is wrong, that is, in a sense, just an opinion. But we have to be quite careful with claims like, just an opinion. So it's like, yes, I mean, ultimately, I just do have certain kind of fundamental values where, I kind of care about other people. I don't like suffering, etc. I might have those as values. But I mean, look, there are lots of things we can say to somebody who endorses the Holocaust. So we can point out, for instance, we can try to point out that actually engaging in genocide is probably in some conflict with values that they already hold. I mean, it's actually pretty rare that people just do want to impose suffering on others, like just for its own sake. Most people actually do want, peace and prosperity and so on. In fact, I believe, I think most of the people who were living in Germany at the time the Holocaust occurred actually just wanted, they did want peace. They did value that as something worthwhile. And, you can point out that doing things like the Holocaust is in tension with that. We could also point out that the Holocaust was driven by just false empirical claims. Like the Nazis made all sorts of claims about, what Jews were doing in the world that were simply false. And you don't have to get into morality to assess that, right? Like
just the mere empirical happenstance. Just discuss the facts. You're wrong when you make the claim that Jews are biologically inferior. You're wrong when you make the claim that Jews are manipulating the world and all that kind of stuff.
Exactly. And so you can sort of have the debate on that level. And once you recognise that Jews are not fundamentally different from the rest of us, then
the Holocaust becomes indefensible.
Yeah. And I mean, you can also just appeal to people's self-interest. You can say, well, look, if you live in a society where, we are like genociding people who do not fit with, the norm, well, maybe there are things about you that might in the future turn out to be. You
the
know,
Niemoller poem, right? How does it go? Something like when they came for the communists, I could have said something, I could have done something, but I didn't. And then eventually, when they came for me, there was no one left to defend anyone. Yeah, I think that's such a good point as well.
Yeah, so there's so many things we can say to people who think that genocide is a good idea. And I don't think it really makes much difference whether you're a realist or anti-realist. Like, even if you're a moral realist, you're going to say the same sorts of things. I mean, I imagine that Sam Harris and people who support Sam Harris, like, if you were to actually meet somebody who endorses genocide, right? What would you say to them, right? Like, let's say that there are objective moral facts. How do you prove that it's objectively wrong to engage in genocide? Well, you'd probably say exactly the sort of things I would say, right? You know, you would appeal to other values that the person holds, or you would, point out that they have made empirical mistakes, and so on.
Telling them that there's a moral ought that they've missed out is probably not going to be an assertion that changes their mind. As you quite rightly point out, you're going to have to reason with them. And yeah, I love this where we've gone here, Kane, because what you're actually doing right now is pointing out and making clear that the moral realist, people like you and I, actually have numerous options available to us when it comes to dissuading somebody of their genocidal intentions and arguing that they're actually wrong. So we can still prove that somebody who wants to genocide a people, we can still prove that they're wrong. We're just not going to be doing it using the tools of so-called moral realism. We're going to be doing it using the tools of empiricism, doing it using shared experience. I mean, like you said, and as the reason I mentioned the Niemoller poem, just by pointing out to someone, hey, by the way, you live in a society where people are being genocided quite a bit. How do you know you're not next? Right? And that mirrors. So in other words, that's egoism, right? When somebody is just completely self-interested.
Yes, and
so from a completely egoist perspective, you can eliminate somebody's genocidal intentions because you can appeal to their own self-interest or their own kind of sense of survival.
I think you can get quite far with that. I mean, like,
I agree.
What the Nazis were doing, they weren't just genociding Jews. It was Jews, gypsies, homosexuals,
disabled.
People who are people who are disabled, opponents. Like, you can easily become disabled, right? So there's nothing guaranteeing that you're not going to be next on the chopping block. And
such a good point. It's such a good point. So listen up, everybody at home. And I don't mean to sound preachy, but if you were of the view, as I was at one point in time, and so believe me, I'm not preaching here because I was a victim of all of these misapprehensions about anti-realism as well, where anti-realism gets equated with moral relativism, basically. And yeah, I was under the impression that anti-realists have no leg to stand on when it comes to arguing with somebody who supports the Holocaust. Again, people like William Lane Craig and various Christian apologists will argue that the anti-realists doesn't have a leg to stand on when it comes to moral discussions, when it comes to dissuading somebody about the Holocaust, that without moral imperatives, without moral realism, or without God, they would argue, right? Because they would argue, as you pointed out earlier, Kane, that God is the thing that gives us our moral oughts and our moral imperatives. Without that, suddenly morality just becomes a cavalcade of brutality, and it's just your opinion versus my opinion. Whereas, as Kane quite rightly points out, there are actually numerous methods that an anti-realist can use to still argue legitimately and factually against the Holocaust. You appeal to the mistaken understanding that the Nazis had about Jews and what Jews were doing, and their bogus, ridiculous claims about the Untermenschen and the subhumans, and that they're more, vermin-like. You can dismiss all of that stuff with a good understanding of science. You can also appeal to shared values. They might share a value somewhere down the line that allows you to appeal to them at that level. And as Kane also pointed out, you can appeal to their very own self-interest, which the Niemoller poem actually demonstrates with, I dare say, beautiful clarity. Is that a fair summary of the points that you've made, Kane?
Yeah. And
you know what? I agree with you entirely. And again, I have to credit you because you were my introduction to all of those methodologies and talking points, and they were formative in me becoming an anti-realist. And while, as you can tell from this conversation, I'm still learning the ropes where anti-realism is concerned, and as I admitted to you off air, and I'll admit now to the listeners, I am operating at the very limits of my cognitive capacity when I have this conversation. Meta-ethics is hard, right? And so if you've been listening, dear listener, if you've gotten this far in the conversation and you found it difficult, please understand that nobody is saying that this is easy. And Kane, you were actually quite gentlemanly before we started filming here, and you pointed out to me to kind of assuage my concerns. You said, no, meta-ethics is difficult. It's completely natural and normal to be struggling and finding it difficult. And so... yeah, I love those points. Is there anything else you want to add there, Kane? Is there anything else an anti-realist can do to dissuade somebody of the Holocaust that doesn't require appealing to moral realism, or doesn't require that we believe in the delusion, that, at least that I've come to be convinced, the delusion of the existence of moral oughts or moral imperatives or moral facts?
I think broadly speaking, those are the main ones. I'm not sure.
No, that's fair enough. Let's move on. We're almost at the end here, and I don't want to abuse your time because you've already been very generous already. So let's move on to the one or two more objections that a Harris fan or a moral realist might raise, and get your response to those, and then we'll get to the end here. So. Number 3 I wrote down here is, are we holding reality to an unfair standard? Aren't all fields propped up by some subjective move? Medicine is objective, but only if you grant the subjective goal of health. Morality is objective, but only if you grant the subjective goal of well-being. Harris himself says, it's not medicine to say that you should cure disease, but once we accept that subjective flag in the sand, suddenly we can have a science of medicine. It's not science to say that we should go out and study the empirical world, but as soon as we accept that ought, we go out and we do it, and we learn about the empirical world, right? And so this is Harris's point, and I have to admit, this is the last dangling, so I don't know your response to this, but this is the last dangling thread in my mind that is holding me to one extent or another, and obviously I've already self-identified as an anti-realist. So this is just the one final doubt that's in my mind, Kane. So I'm really, really enthusiastically looking forward to your response here. So again, just to reiterate, there is no ought when it comes to medicine, right? I mean, we just have to plant a subjective flag in the ground, and we all accept that there's a science of medicine, right? But you have to accept the ought, which is we ought help people or make people better or cure their illness. As soon as you accept that as an ought, the science of medicine is birthed or can proceed, basically. So, in other words, why can't we do the same for morality? Why can't we just plant a subjective flag in the ground, just like every other science does, and say we ought look after people's well-being? And if we plant that subjective flag in the ground, doesn't everything else after that point become objective? Can't you have a science of morality informed by the naturalistic facts of pain and pleasure and all the rest of it? Can't you have that if you're just willing to accept and grant that subjective flag, a subjective flag that we have to plant in the ground for literally every other science, and even reality itself? To have this conversation, I have to presuppose that you're real and that we're having this conversation and that the world is existent in some way, and that I'm not the only mind in the universe, or in whatever reality exists, as a solipsist might argue. Do you see where that concern is coming from?
I think there's a few things to say. So, I mean, one point is, like, in a sense, I mean, I completely agree, because I completely agree that there's, that science can inform us about how best to realize our values. So if we adopt the value that, let's say we just take it that what we ought to do is minimize what sucks. Maybe we're just like kind of straightforward utilitarians about this. We just think what we want to do is like maximize pleasure and minimize pain for the, largest number of people. Well, science can tell you how to do that. And absolutely, which is Harris's claim. Yes. So I think that Harris kind of, it's worth pointing out, because Harris sometimes, I think, says this thing where he's like, well, we can kind of have a science of morality, right? Like, science can tell us what we ought to do. But notice what's going on here, right? What he's actually doing is he's appealing to just a kind of brute intuition that what we ought to do is, say, minimize suffering, minimize what sucks, as he might put it. And then, of course, the empirical facts can tell us how to minimize what sucks. But ultimately,
the brute intuition is still a brute intuition.
Is what's driving this.
But again, his point is, doesn't every science have a brute intuition at its foundation? So are we being unfair as meta-ethicists by holding morality to this arguably higher standard of requiring something extra that we don't hold other domains to?
Yes. So part of the issue here is, the one problem, I think, is that it's just not a legitimate move at this point in the debate to just assert that brute intuition, because there's like a ton of good reasons to think that actually what we ought to do isn't just, minimize suffering or whatever. Like, there's loads of very good arguments against utilitarianism, for instance. And like, so here's one. Here's one example, right?
Just before you go into the example, are you identifying? Because I think it actually might be a fair categorization. Are you identifying Sam Harris as a utilitarian?
Not necessarily, no.
And just for the benefit of the audience, the utilitarian is the one who thinks that we should do whatever we ought to do is whatever satisfies the majority.
Yeah,
the greatest good for the greatest number, right?
It doesn't really matter what Sam Harris's own particular opinion is on this. I'm going to present two options, and he can take either of them or neither of them. But it hopefully illustrates one of the issues.
Sure.
Okay, so one thing we might aim for is utilitarianism. We just might aim for maximizing welfare for the greatest number. But hang on a minute. We might think, well, it's not just the amount of welfare that matters. Distribution matters. We might think that there's some sort of requirement that of equality. I guess we can kind of imagine a society in which, maybe if we enslave 1% of the population, 99% of the population can live incredibly good lives. Versus a society where, everybody works, nobody is enslaved, but people are kind of equal. We might think that the equal society, even if welfare is lower, is better. And the point is that debate is simply not something that you can establish with science. Science can tell you, right, if your aim is to just maximize welfare, it can tell you, go for the utilitarian society, right? Maybe it will tell you that.
So this is still the value ought dichotomy.
Yeah.
Am I correct there?
Yeah.
It's even let's just imagine science can establish values. We still wouldn't know what we should or shouldn't do with respect to those values. Yeah. We'd still have a problem there, right?
Well, and I'm also pointing, I guess, to a kind of fact value thing, because one value is just like weighing up pain and pleasure in the way the utilitarian does, and then another value is equality, right? So, we have these sort of two things. These things can come apart. And again, if you want a society like an egalitarian, equal society, science can tell you how to do that, right? You can, read the economics literature and figure out the right sort of tax policies to achieve equality. But it's not going to tell you which option to take. And if you want to know which option to take, then you're going to have to engage in, philosophical debate. You're going to have to engage in moral debate in a way that isn't just fixed by the empirical facts.
Yes.
So I think that there's, and in a certain sense, the same actually is true of other fields. I guess you can say with respect to medicine, what are we actually aiming for when we do medicine, right? Are we aiming to just maximize life expectancy, or are we aiming to maximize quality of life? So again, right, in that case, it may well be
that is fascinating. Okay, yeah. You're now dissuading me of that final little tether. It looks like I'm never going to be a realist again. Sorry, please continue along that thread, because this is exciting.
Okay, yeah. I guess that's the point, right? It may well be the case that there are things we can do to make people live longer, which ultimately would end up like that. Maybe their lives would just not be that good. I mean, it might be that in order to have the longest life possible, you just don't, I don't know, never eat chocolate, never drink, or, you know, but who would want that, right? I mean, we don't just want to maximize life expectancy. We want quality of life. We want to have fun. So, you know, we're weighing up these two things. And actually, so even in that field, I would kind of just accept the point. Like, medicine can't tell you what to do, right? If you're doing medicine, you can figure out how to live longer. You can figure out what sorts of things make life fun, and so improve quality of life. But it's still up to us what we ultimately value. So I actually agree with Harris that these two things are kind of the same. But I guess I'm still drawing the opposite conclusion. I'm saying, well, no, actually, like even in the case of medicine, it's up to us, right? We have to, we decide, and the science of like human biology cannot tell us what to value. It cannot tell us whether we should value living for as long as possible or having
Quality
fun.
of life.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, in other words, you are being consistent. You're not being unfair. You're saying, yes, medicine has a pulling itself up by its own bootstraps move at the foundation, which is we ought to cure people or help them with their sicknesses. But even if you accept that ought, even if you granted it as an imperative, as an objective ought, you're still articulating the fact that the facts of biology still don't tell us what we should or shouldn't do with respect to that ought, because there's still a question of whether or not we should prolong people's lives as much as possible according to the Hippocratic Oath, for example, or whether or not we should maximize the quality of life, which might indeed end up in a shorter existence because we enjoy drinking copious amounts of alcohol and eating unhealthy foods, right? Is that a rough approximation of the point you're making, Kane?
Yeah.
That's just absolutely fantastic. That is brilliant. Okay, right. I'm learning a lot. I mean it. This is great. And you know what? I often, when I'm making videos about things that I know a little bit more about, I often, speak much more confidently and authoritatively. But I'm so happy in this conversation to take a back seat and just listen to you and learn from you in real time, because I want my audience to see that, like, we all have to have a slice of humble pie every now and then, and we all have to say, you know what, I doff my cap to you, Kane. I said this to you before we even started filming, that when I watch your channel, and by the way, if I didn't say this in the open, Christ above, I better say it now. Please go and watch Kane's channel. You know what I'm going to do, Kane? I'm going to record a separate intro to our conversation where I recommend your channel, so that recommendation is at the very start. And I will do that as a quick intro. And it's really important that you go check out Kane's channel. And I know my channel is smaller than yours, Kane, but if some of my viewers go over to yours, that would be awesome, because you will learn as much as I have learned from Kane's channel. And like I said, I don't mind humbling myself and pointing out that I'm learning an immense amount in this conversation. And it's another reason why I'm just so delighted that you're here. But look, we're almost at the end. There's one more challenge that I've written down here. One more challenge that I've written down that I'll say to you, Kane, and then we can bring us to a close here and get some final thoughts. But this final challenge we might have already actually addressed more or less, so I'll say it and we'll go from there. There are no oughts, claims Harris. It's a fact that we move from pain towards pleasure. If we feed the facts of what leads to flourishing into that system, do we need anything else? And I think, if I'm not mistaken, your answer is no, that's actually fine. It's just not moral realism. Is that your response?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much, right? I think that there's actually going to be, again, there's still going to be a lot of debate there about, so with respect to, utilitarianism versus egalitarianism. There's actually still going to be a debate, but in principle, I mean, look, yeah, I mean, if you just want to say that, look, I care about bringing about as much flourishing as possible, I want to minimize what sucks, and so on. Like, yeah, if you start from that assumption, then you can use science and you can figure out what to do. But it's just not moral realism. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And I'm so happy because it proves that I learned something in this conversation, because I knew you were going to say, yeah, I don't have too much of a problem with that, although there are finer details to be etched out, like you said, the debate between utilitarianism and egalitarianism, which again is a fascinating discussion. But even if you accept that, even if you grant it for the sake of conversation, that simply isn't moral realism. It is just human beings acting in accordance with their preferences, which is, in your view, and I think in mine, just a poor definition for morality. Would you agree with that?
Lots of different. I suppose it depends on what you have in mind by like definition of morality. But it certainly isn't what I would. I mean, I would not consider that to be a moral realist position.
Sure.
Yeah.
Kane, I think that's it. I mean, we've addressed everything. I didn't think we'd even get to everything that I wanted to discuss, but we more or less have gotten to everything I wanted to discuss. I guess just one final thing, and I've written down in my notes here that it would be remiss of me not to mention, because I have mentioned at a number of points in the conversation that people conflate moral anti-realism with relativism. Do you think that there's a comment you can offer on that to kind of differentiate the two? Because am I mistaken here? There is a relevant distinction between the two, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's an important point.
That might be a nice point to finish on, Kane, because moral relativism is a pejorative in the circles I run in. Yeah. Nobody wants to be called a moral relativist. And so it would be very useful, just for my edification and for my audience, to understand the distinction between moral relativism on one hand and moral anti-realism on the other. And the floor is yours, my friend.
So I take it that when we say moral relativism, we have in mind the idea that something like, we ought not to criticize other cultures, or, maybe there's some culture that engages, I don't know, like female circumcision, right? Well, that's just their culture, and
we mustn't question it.
They have different values, right? Look, from an anti-realist point of view, I would just say, well, like, why not? I mean, it's what are you saying, that it's an objective fact that I ought not to criticize other cultures? No, actually, I think there are some things, like I value, compassion and individual rights, and that's how I want the world to be. I don't want there to be people, cutting up like female girls' genitals. That's awful. So, what's the problem, right? Like,
ironically, the moral relativist is actually introducing a moral imperative that we ought not criticize other cultures, despite the fact that they're suggesting morality is relative, which is what separates them from the anti-realist, who has no shackles in this conversation and can criticize anyone and everything, right? I
mean, look, an anti-realist could be a relativist, but it's just not required. When I look at other cultures in the world, if I look at, let's look at what's happened in Afghanistan, right? I think that's awful, because, I value freedom and liberty, and, I think, the idea of forcing women to wear burqas and so on is horrifying. So, and there's nothing inconsistent with anti-realism. Like, those are my values. That's what I care about. The kind of world that I want to live in is completely opposed to what the Taliban are doing. So I don't think there's any reason why I would be committed to that kind of relativism.
That's just perfect. I wanted to give you the floor to explain that, and it's because, and I'm going to show you my hand now, it's because I've heard you give that explanation before on your channel. And it completely flipped my thinking, because I was one of those people who, again, like many others, just assumed that anti-realism and relativism are in bed together, and they're not. In fact, it came up with Rationality Rules. Rationality Rules, who has since changed his mind as a consequence of his encounter with you. Look at you changing his mind. How dare you? But ever since he had his conversation with you, he has become dissuaded on that matter, because he put to you in that podcast, I still remember it, the reason he said to you, the reason I'm not a big fan of anti-realism is because I feel like we have to be able to say to cultures and societies that brutalize their people that they ought not do that. And with anti-realism, you can't do that. And you took him to task on that. And by the way, this is not me intending on running rationality rules through the mud. I love rationality rules. I hope to interview him on my channel someday. And, rationality rules, if you do watch this, oh my God, what an honor that would be. Just like it's been an honor to have Kane on here today. I'm growing and I want to learn. And I think I've learned a lot from Kane here today. And I think I could learn an enormous amount from rationality rules. The only reason I raise this as an example is because it is an example of somebody who conflated moral relativism and anti-realism, just like I did. And anybody could make that mistake. And I think a lot of people do, Kane. I'm assuming you've run into that quite a bit.
Yeah, it's quite common, I think. But I do think that it's an error.
I agree.
And yeah, like the best way to see it, as I say, it's like the anti-realist is going to say, if you say to an anti-realist, like, you ought not to criticize other cultures, I mean, the anti-realist is to say, well, like, why not? That's not one of my values, right? And they can. And when an anti-realist comes into contact with other cultures, they can use the sort of tools that we already explained when we were talking about, the genocide example, right?
Yep.
There's actually lots of things that we can say to try to persuade people.
Empirical data, shared experience, egoism and self-interest, all relevant tools that can be used by the anti-realist, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Kane, you know what? I think that's a fantastic place to leave it. Okay. If I dare say so, I think with your unbelievably awesome assistance, I think this video serves as quite a helpful introduction to anti-realism and why it might actually be the correct position to adopt. It also serves as, I think, a quite a good defense of anti-realism and why it's not synonymous with moral relativism. And I just want to thank you sincerely for joining me here today. I'm a nobody, and I just reached out to you on Twitter, and you responded within 10 minutes and said, yeah, sure, let's have a conversation. And I just want you to know that I do not at all take that for granted. And I'm just so thoroughly happy that you've shared your time and been so generous with your time here this evening. And I know I had lots of technical issues at the start, and you were just the perfect gentleman, and you sat there and you were patient, and here we are. And I'm just so thoroughly happy with the conversation. And so I doff my cap to you, sir. Thank you so much for joining me here today.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, thanks for having me on. That was a lot of fun. So,
yeah, I mean, I unfortunately I might have overshadowed some of your points with my loud, obnoxious laughing every now and then, because some of the examples and things we got into were hilarious. But yeah, look, guys, it would be remiss of me not to say it once again. If you enjoyed this conversation, you have to go look at Kane's channel. You will learn an enormous amount, as I have, and I really do encourage you to go and look at his channel. I will include the link in the description below, of course. And Kane, I hope we can do this again sometime, because this was great. This was awesome.
Just let me know, and if you have some ideas for the future, then that'd be cool.
Fantastic. You can educate me again sometime. So guys, on that note, if you did like the video, drop a like in it. And, if you've been enjoying the content more generally, do consider hitting that subscribe button. And if you do, don't forget to check the bell notification icon. That way you'll be able to stay up to date with all things on the channel, and you'll even be notified as and when my latest videos go live. So thank you again, Kane, for joining me. Thank you, dear listener, for getting this far in the conversation. And I hope to see you in the next one. All the best. Bye-bye.